Welcome back, folks. Today we are talking about scientific ethics and funding. So we'll talk a little bit about the history of clinical trials and human experimentation as it relates to the ethics of doing these things. We'll talk a little bit about the scientific ethics of publishing, as well as funding. And before we jump into today's videos, I do want to have this content warning right up front. I will be discussing some challenging topics such as racism, enslavement of people, and abortion. I hope that you can listen to these videos with an open mind, and I hope you are ready to learn because these things are important for us to know as we move forward in this class. So clinical trials, at least as they have developed in the United States, have largely a racist history. This on the screen here is a quote from a neurosurgeon during his speech in the 1960s at Tulane Medical School. So he said it was cheaper to use N-word than cats because they were everywhere and cheap experimental animals. So I think this gives you an idea of how human experimentation was viewed as late as the 1960s. But the history of human experimentation in the United States goes back farther than that, of course. Probably one of the most well-known examples of breaching human ethics, in breaching scientific ethics in human experimentation is the Tuskegee study. This was performed from 1932 to 1972. The full name of the Tuskegee study is given to you there in the first bullet point. And so in this study, what happened was 600 black men and their families were brought into this study believing that they were being treated for syphilis. But what happened is during the time of this study, a treatment for syphilis became available, and it was shown that this treatment was massively effective. And so these folks participating in the study were not provided with this treatment. Rather, their disease was allowed to progress, and they didn't know, they weren't told that there was a treatment available to them that would help them get better. And so this is a problem because the long-term effects of syphilis are massive damage to your nervous system, and this can eventually result in insanity. So these people were kind of being allowed to progress through a very serious disease, all the while they could have been kind of treated and cured. But this isn't the origin of medicine in the United States or human experimentation in the United States. So let's take it back even farther. So much of the knowledge of healing in the United States came from indigenous folks here and came from folks who were forcibly brought from Africa. There were some enslaved people who were trained in traditional African medicine with a focus on holistic healing. In contrast, kind of our modern allopathic understanding of medicine in the US is really kind of treatment of symptoms focused, right? If you go into the doctor's office, they'll probably ask you, what are your symptoms? And so this kind of difference between the way that Western physicians and other physicians, especially from Africa, thought about medicine resulted in Western doctors really belittling African healers' knowledge and efficacy, even though people from Africa really brought an abundance of knowledge with them when they were forcibly brought here. For example, the first treatments for scurvy originated from these folks in Africa. And so following this era where African people were forcibly brought to the United States, Thus began a long history of experimentation on them. So from the 16 to 1700s, doctors kind of began to shift towards a more scientific study of disease. Think experiments, right? Prior to this, experimentation really wasn't as common in the physician's practice. However, these doctors found it unacceptable to experiment on their white patients, so they used folks who were enslaved. It was easier to do this on the enslaved folks because there were already existing stigmas surrounding them. For example, they were stronger or didn't feel as much pain. Now, these things we know to be false, but it helped make this type of experimentation acceptable at the time. Enslaved and free Black people were bought and sold as specimens by doctors. So, for example, John Brown is a person who was used to do research into heat stroke. So they would put him kind of over a pit of burning coals and see how long it took him to pass out while giving him different treatments to see if they affected him. And this type of research could be used in a good way, heat stroke, but it could also be used in negative ways to try to get more work out of enslaved people. Another example is Anarcha Westcott, who was a person who underwent many surgeries without any anesthesia. And these surgeries were performed by a person who is currently known as the father of gynecology. However, all of his background is really from doing experiments on women who weren't consenting to the surgery. And oftentimes, these surgeries resulted in these women being hooked on morphine due to pain management that was required post-surgery. Finally, it has been documented pretty thoroughly that thousands of Black bodies were stolen from graves by a wide variety of medical schools and hospitals because they needed bodies for anatomy classes so their rising physicians could learn. This type of experimentation did not only occur in the United States. More recently than colonial times, there was human experimentation performed in Nazi-occupied Europe. The Nazis were really the originators of twin studies. So they would take two twins and perform experiments on them to see how their reactions or their results would differ. And a lot of times in the study, if a twin died, the control twin would be killed for autopsy as a comparison. So they could directly compare, two people with the same genetic material. The Nazis performed hypothermia studies to see how it was best to recover from hypothermia. For example, they tried boiling water as a treatment for hypothermia. Additionally, they studied sterility and fertility in humans, and so they gave humans things like x-rays or performed surgery on them or gave them drugs and would see how these would affect the ability of these people to make children. And of course, all of this was without the people's consent. Finally, I'll tell one more story that has become more well known, especially over the past 10 years or so. This is the story of Henrietta Lacks and HeLa cells. So HeLa cells are one of the most widely used cancer cells in laboratories today. I have used them in my research, and many other labs that perform research use them. Not just cancer research, all types of research. So these cells were taken from a biopsy of an aggressive cervical cancer that Henrietta Lacks had. You may notice that Henrietta Lacks makes up the word HeLa. And this cell line was the very first immortalized human cell line used in labs. What do I mean by this? I mean that this cell line will grow in a lab forever, unlike most other types of human cells that will die in a lab. So they were kind of this great experimental tool. However, Henrietta Lacks did not give informed consent. She knew a biopsy was being taken, but she did not know that her cells were being taken in a lab and grown outside of her body, and she did not know that those cells would be later used to fund much research done in the United States and throughout the world. The family was only made aware of this happening in 1975, and if you're interested to learn more, I highly recommend you read the book The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks. Now, these cells have resulted in a wide variety of scientific breakthroughs, such as the polio vaccine, developments in cancer treatment and AIDS treatment, and we know a lot more about our immune system than we used to. For example, we learned a lot about the immune system and cancer. Just another example of how scientific ethics went wrong is some researchers injected cancer cells into patients, prisoners, who were healthy to see whether or not they would develop cancer. Up next, we'll learn a little bit about how these historical abuses of power have led to changes to human experimentation today.